Why did ancient humans never wear shoes? Tanzania, 3.6 million years ago. A pair of hominins walks across a fresh layer of wet volcanic ash near a place we now call Laetoli. They aren't thinking about posterity. They're probably just trying to get somewhere before the rain starts again. But the ash sets like plaster, and their footprints, heel strike, weight rolling forward, toes gripping off at the end, survive for longer than the pyramids will exist, longer than writing, longer than the wheel. When paleoanthropologists uncovered them in 1978, they found something oddly intimate, an arch, a big toe aligned with the others, not splayed out like an ape's. In other words, a foot built essentially like yours, bare, unshod, doing exactly what it was built to do. And that's the strange fact sitting at the center of this whole story. For something like 99% of the roughly 6 to 7 million year span of human and pre-human evolution, nobody wore anything on their feet. No sandals, no wrapped hide, nothing. So the question worth asking isn't the lazy version. Didn't they know better? It's sharper than that. Why did a species that eventually invented fire, language, and eventually the moon landing wait so long to cover its feet? What was bare skin doing right that we assume shoes do better? The honest answer turns out to be more mechanical, more geographic, and more recent than most people expect. A tangle of biomechanics, climate migration, and archaeology that only really resolves in the last 50,000 years of a multi-million-year story. Let's deal with the cartoon version first, because it's everywhere. The assumption is that early humans went barefoot the way a toddler goes without a coat, out of ignorance, discomfort, gritted teeth, waiting for the invention that would finally save them. Primitive people, tough feet, hard life, end of story. It's a tidy narrative. It's also mostly backwards. The foot our ancestors were walking around on wasn't a design flaw waiting for a patch. It was, and still is, one of the more sophisticated pieces of biomechanical engineering evolution ever produced. And for most of the environments early humans actually lived in, it needed no upgrade at all. Start with the anatomy itself, because the numbers are more specific than people expect. The human foot contains 26 bones, 33 joints, and a network of over 100 muscles, tendons, and ligaments. Nearly a quarter of all the bones in your entire body live below your ankles. Packed into the sole are somewhere north of 200,000 nerve endings, an extraordinarily dense sensory carpet that reads texture, temperature, incline, and load with every single step. If the sole can feel a pebble, a root, or a shift in slope in real time, then the whole body can adjust its balance and gait before an injury happens rather than after. In plain terms, bare feet aren't just tough skin, they're a constant live feed of ground information straight to the brain, and once you bury that feed under a rigid sole, you're flying with the instruments switched off. The second mechanism is about mechanics, not sensation, specifically the arch. The human arch acts like a leaf spring, storing and releasing elastic energy with each stride, and researchers studying persistence hunting, the practice of literally running prey animals to exhaustion over distances that could stretch past 25 or 30 kilometers, have argued this spring-loaded, barefoot-adapted stride was central to how early Homo got enough calories to grow the expensive brain we're using right now. If the arch functions as an energy return spring only when the foot can flex, splay, and grip naturally against real ground, then wrapping it in a stiff sole doesn't just change comfort, it changes the physics of the stride itself. Translate that for a friend and it's simple. Your foot was doing some of the work a running shoe now claims credit for, millions of years before anyone stitched leather together. I'll admit the persistence hunting theory is still argued over by specialists. Some researchers think its role in early human diet has been overstated relative to scavenging and gathering, so treat it as a strong, contested thread rather than settled law. The third piece is the simplest and most overlooked: geography. For roughly 90 to 95% of the time since the genus Homo first appears, our ancestors were living in warm to temperate African environments: savanna, woodland, Rift Valley terrain, where the ground rarely dropped below freezing, and the biggest daily risk to a foot was a thorn, not frostbite. If the environment doesn't regularly threaten tissue damage from cold, then there's little evolutionary or practical pressure to invent a barrier against it. So footwear wasn't rejected, it simply hadn't been needed yet, because the room the story was happening in was, for most of its length, warm. Here's where the narrative bends though, and this is the moment worth slowing down for. It's tempting to imagine barefoot life as a kind of primal purity that technology eventually corrupted, humans finally escaping nature through shoes. That's too romantic in one direction. The truth is closer to this. Going barefoot wasn't virtue, and wearing shoes wasn't decline. Both are just tools responding to specific problems, and the problem that actually triggered footwear wasn't comfort or vanity. It was ice. Around 40,000 to 26,000 years ago, something shows up in the skeletal record that reads almost like a forensic clue. Anthropologist Eric Trinkhaus, examining Upper Paleolithic remains across Eurasia, noticed that the smaller toes, the 2nd through 5th, became measurably less robust in this window compared to earlier populations, while the big toe stayed relatively strong. Toe bones only build density and strength in response to the mechanical stress of gripping bare ground. If a population's small toes stop bearing that load, then something is now standing between the foot and the earth, redistributing the pressure. In other words, the bones themselves seem to be recording the quiet arrival of the shoe decades before anyone finds an actual shoe to hold up as proof. And we do eventually find one. In 2008, in the Areni 1 cave complex tucked into the cliffs of Armenia's Vayats Dzor province, archaeologists pulled a single leather moccasin-style shoe out of the dry, low-oxygen sediment, stuffed with grass, still laced, dated to roughly 3500 BCE, making it, at the time of discovery, the oldest complete leather shoe ever recovered. It was a right foot, a European women's size 7 by modern sizing, preserved by nothing more dramatic than sheep dung and dry cave air, keeping the leather from rotting for over 5,000 years. A different, colder story sits in the Ötztal Alps on the Austrian-Italian border, where in 1991, hikers found a mummified body melting out of a glacier, a man who died around 3300 BCE, now known as Ötzi. His feet were wrapped in an elaborate cold weather system, deer-hide uppers, bearskin soles, and a net of tree bark strung inside the shoe to hold in a layer of dry grass insulation, essentially a copper-age sock built from the forest floor. He wasn't wearing this for style. Ötzi died alone, wounded, in the mountains, and the shoes on his feet were the difference between surviving a few extra hours in the cold and not. Zoom out from these two men, one buried in a cave, one frozen on a mountain, and a pattern emerges that spans the whole planet. Footwear invention doesn't track intelligence or progress in any straight line. It tracks latitude and terrain. Populations that pushed into colder, rockier, more thermally hostile environments, the Eurasian steppe, the circumpolar north, high alpine passes, developed increasingly enclosed, insulated footwear over thousands of years. Populations that stayed in warm, forgiving climates, much of sub-Saharan Africa, the tropical Americas, island Southeast Asia, kept feet bare or nearly so well into the modern era, not from technological lag, but because the ground itself never demanded the trade-off. Even today, elite distance runners from barefoot-adapted regions and the entire modern minimalist running movement are, in a sense, arguing the same case Laetoli made 3.6 million years ago, that the human foot, left alone, already knows more than we tend to give it credit for. So if you're looking for a single villain or a single hero in this story, there isn't one. There's a sensory organ with 200,000 nerve endings that spent millions of years reading the Earth directly. There's a climate map that only turned hostile to bare skin in certain corners of the world. And there's a moment, sometime after 40,000 years ago, when cold finally forced a covering onto feet that had never needed one before. 3 separate mechanisms, one converging answer. Humans didn't wear shoes for most of their history, not because they hadn't figured it out yet, but because, for most of that history, in most of the places they lived, their own feet were already the better technology.